Carnage in Ukraine. Bodies of civilians reveal possible war crimes in the town of Bucha. Anguish among generations of women taking children to safety while their men fight the Russians. Those who stayed find shelter in unusual places. And the sounds of peace as music transcends war. Now, on the Inside Story, Carnage in Ukraine.
I'm Patsy Huswara, VOA White House Bureau Chief. President Joe Biden this week went out of his way to condemn Russia's President Vladimir Putin as a war criminal, prompted by images of what appears to be bodies with hands and feet tied, shot execution style. The grisly discovery in Bucha and the damage uncovered elsewhere in Kyiv came after Russian forces retreated from their positions near the capital city. We begin our coverage in Bucha, Ukraine, with VOA's Heather Murdoch, and we warn you, the images you're about to see are disturbing.
This is Bucha in Ukraine.
You may have heard over the weekend, Ukrainian forces took this town and all the towns surrounding Kyiv, and now no part of the Kyiv region is controlled or occupied by Russia. But as you can see, the violence here was considerable, and authorities say hundreds of civilians were found dead.
Many of the bodies were found on the street. Right now, they are identifying the bodies and have identified 170 people, but there are still a lot of people to process.
We actually witnessed authorities somewhat ceremoniously wrap up 6 bodies of people who had been shot and later burnt. Ukrainian authorities say the burning was potentially to cover up war crimes.
At this time, they were taking those bodies, putting them in plastic bags to take to the experts to identify them. I'm Heather Murdoch, VOA News in Bucha, Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Bucha, less than 30 kilometers from the capital, where bodies lie motionless in the streets, some with hands tied behind their backs.
It is very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. People left in barrels, basements, having been strangled or simply tortured. These are war crimes, and they will be recognized by the world as genocide.
The Pentagon says it's obvious Russia is responsible, with President Joe Biden on Monday condemning the brutality.
And what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it. Up to Allah.
Genocide?
No, I think it is a war crime.
What are you going to do about it, sir? Are you going to do more sanctions on Russia?
I'm seeking more sanctions, yes.
Russia has denied responsibility and called the images out of Bucha fake.
After the Russian military had left, according to the plans and agreements, a fake video was staged that is now being spread through all media channels and social media by the Ukrainian representatives and their Western patrons.
But satellite imagery shows bodies had lain in Bucha for weeks before Russian troops left. Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said most of the Russian troops amassed near Kyiv and its suburbs have retreated, moving out to resupply as Ukrainians attack them.
The Russians have, at least for the time being, given up on a ground offensive against Kyiv.
Western officials say Russia now appears ready to focus more on the Donbas region to the east, which has seen recent increases in Russian airstrikes and military maneuvers. And Ukrainian officials warn that atrocities in the towns and cities that they haven't reached could be even worse than those in Bucha. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
Weeks of being pummeled by Russian attacks is creating a sense among locals in western Ukraine to prepare for a long war. Many say they will not accept a peace agreement that includes ceding territory to Russia, even if their leaders can eventually make a deal. VOA's Heather Murdoch reports from the Ukrainian cities of Lviv and Ternopil.
Here in Ternopil, a western Ukrainian city packed with displaced families, aid workers are preparing food, clothes, and other necessities for local war victims, and to send to the east, where battles still rage despite ongoing peace talks. Many say they don't want a peace deal that means giving up land to Russia, and they are preparing to live in a country at war for months or even longer.
We don't want these peace talks to end in an agreement that would be bad for Ukraine. We want to free our land, and for that we are ready to fight until the end.
Religious leaders in the area echo the popular sentiment, but they worry about the devastating impact the war has already had on Ukrainian fighters and civilians, including millions who have fled their homes.
War is about chaos and ruin. In the same way cities get ruined, a person gets destroyed inside. After you come back from the war, you can't be the same person.
Major cities in the east now appear abandoned in places, and western cities, like Lviv, are overflowing with displaced people, many separated from their loved ones.
My daughter and grandchildren are in Slovakia. My older daughter is in Kyiv. And me and my son-in-law are here in Lviv.
She says she hopes the war will end soon because Lubava, who preferred not to provide her last name, like so many other farmers, needs to start planting soon if she is to harvest this year. Aid workers in Ternopil say they fear Ukraine could become frozen in an endless war. And while they may reject the idea of giving up Ukrainian land, some volunteers say they still support peace talks.
You always need to speak. Intelligent people should talk because human nature is designed so people can communicate. This is why we need to do everything we can to make a ceasefire.
He says when leaders negotiate, it mitigates the amount of violence on the ground. But other clergy warn that if a deal is reached, it will only be valuable if people keep the promises made in the pact. Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Ternopil and Lviv, Ukraine.
Uprooted from their homes and now fleeing for safety, many Ukrainian families have been forced to separate in order to survive. With the men staying back to fight the Russians, generations of women are leaving with their children and grandchildren, seeking refuge in neighboring Poland. VOA's Celia Mendoza is in the border village of Medica.
A few weeks ago, Vida Pavlina was an ordinary Ukrainian grandmother. Today, she's a refugee.
In Soviet times, we lived well. We probably don't need Russia after this. I don't know how to explain it.
Pavlina had to flee Kyiv with her grandchildren fearing for their lives.
Because of the war, because of the bombs, because they're bombing Ukraine, shooting villages, they do scary things. Everyone went wherever they could. We tried to stick together, and now we have decided to save our children, our angels. It's not their fault.
Yulia Usik is a mother of two. After surviving nearly 2 weeks of Russian attacks and bombings, Usik and her husband decided it was time to leave Kyiv.
We were under attack and shelling for 13 days, and my husband told me to please get the children out because they were traumatized. My husband is in Kyiv. He's 33 years old. He promised he will come back for us.
Lilia Kostenko is the grandmother of two youths, Timur and Damir. For her family, the plan initially was to flee to a cottage outside of Kyiv. But as the Russian forces drew closer, plans changed.
Our husbands told us go to Lviv. Our daughter's friends took us in at their place. And then explosions started again. They blew up the airport there, and we decided to leave, now with our daughter's friends.
Kostenko never imagined she would have to live through war in the 21st century, more than 75 years after the end of World War II.
My grandfather fought in Poland, and it's horrible, of course. I remembered it.
For Pavlina, it is like taking a trip back in history.
I remember the state of the country, how the villages were at that time. 1954 was also hard, very hard. Oh God. We want peace and that the soldiers who are there can protect us. We just want everything to be fine and that there would be peace.
Refugees tell VOA they hope to be able to go home one day with their kids and grandkids, whom they describe as young and resilient, and likely to recover from the trauma of war, if and when peace returns to Ukraine. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, Medica, Poland.
While more than 4 million Ukrainians have fled the country, tens of millions of people remain in Ukraine, millions of them displaced. With massive damage to their property and homes, finding shelter has become an issue. VOA's Anna Kostushenko reports from the city of Lviv, where soccer stadiums have now been turned into refugee camps.
A large stadium on the outskirts of Lviv was built to accommodate over 34,000 soccer fans. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the stadium is serving as a refugee coordination center. Buses bring refugees from all over Ukraine. In just the first week, over 13,000 people came here.
The life of every Ukrainian changed after February 24th.
Olga Manko is the director of the Arena Lviv Stadium. Before the invasion, her job was to organize large-scale sporting events and concerts. But since the beginning of Russia's invasion, her main duty is assisting refugees.
We help volunteers at humanitarian headquarters. We peel potatoes, we wash dishes, we cook.
Many of the refugees who came here have already lost their homes. Irina is one of them. She came here from just outside Kiev.
We were waiting and waiting, but it only got worse. All the villages close to us were occupied by Russians.
When she realized things were very unlikely to improve, Irina was forced to leave her home.
Occupiers were locking people in the basements of their own houses. They were mocking people if they felt like it. They raped women. They do what they want. They could even kill the owner of the house.
Refugee center coordinators say that in the first few days of the invasion, frightened people wanted to go abroad as soon as possible. Those who are arriving now, like Irina, are more willing to wait for the war to end at home or relocate to regions with little or no military action.
We tried to accommodate people within the municipal infrastructure and territorial communities. I mean, those who plan to remain in Ukraine.
The refugee reception center is half empty now, but volunteers operate on the assumption that invasion will go on, and additional beds are already being set up at the stadium.
In case humanitarian corridors are open from Mariupol, Chernihiv, Sumy or Kharkiv, more people would go to Lviv. And then, of course, this hall would be crowded.
Anna Kostyuchenko for Voice of America News, Lviv, Ukraine.
A growing food crisis in Ukraine is bringing several United Nations agencies together with other aid organizations to help feed the hungry refugees. Cindy McCain, widow of Senator John McCain, is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture. VOA Eastern European Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze caught up with her while visiting operations in Poland.
I came here specifically so that I could take a look at the operations that were going on here at reception centers, how our UN agencies are performing, and where we can figure out the gaps. And as you know, there's a huge food crisis. So my role in this is to see what else we can do, how we can manage this, and how we can do more with less. And that's my primary role here. But I have to say, I was utterly overwhelmed with the graciousness and the kindness of the Polish people. This is a lesson in how to treat your fellow man here.
We have an enormous food crisis because of the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the biggest agricultural country and deliver a lot of food specifically to the needs of African and then Middle East. How did we see the impact, and what the world is the world ready to do something about it?
Well, the impacts, I mean, it's a ripple effect that goes around the world. I think what we need to be concerned with right now is in the immediate needs, of course, of the people that are en route or have already arrived in various parts of Europe now, not just Poland but other parts, and also we have to look at the long term. I mean, how do we now make it sustainable to be able to manage and to be able to feed people, give them dignity of life, give them a future. And that's a big job. And so all of our UN agencies are working together on this to not only work on the immediate needs, but work on the long-term plans of it. And it's a huge problem, as you know.
Are those agencies effective? I'm hearing different views, different assessments. Do you think that international agencies are fast and effective enough in this crisis?
Well, I think, for instance, agencies that are emergency relief agencies like World Food Program are meant to do just that. They are fast, they are nimble, they're in a nanosecond on most of these things. And the other agencies are long term, so of course it takes a little longer to gear up and to build up because each situation is different. Nevertheless, they all work together very well, and there's always room for improvement in wherever you are. But I think the UN's doing a marvelous job here.
About their presence on the ground, I talked to some representatives from Ukrainian government, and they are asking for more foot on the ground from international community. They said that they don't see them there, and it's important for them to understand what is going on the ground, to have a better assessment of the needs.
Well, I think there's more than you would think on the ground because every agency that I've spoken to while I've been here, there are people on the ground. But again, this is a tough area and things are dangerous. So there's a give and take as to how you commit your people and making sure that they're also safe. But I understand people's frustration. I also understand the urgency in all this because it is an urgent event and an urgent crisis. But I think, we'll see what happens. There is one person that can stop this, and it's Vladimir Putin. He can stop bombing and pull out. What we do as a group, my group here, is to feed and to not just short-term feeding, but long-term feeding, finding seeds now, making sure that we can produce crops. There are crops in the ground right now, but we may not be able to get them out of the ground because of mining, because of all the other issues that are coming about. We'll get some of it out, but we won't get all of it out. And so therein lies a huge worldwide problem. I think that if we carefully manage this and making sure, keeping in mind that food and agriculture being my most important part of this, but working together and being, as you've seen, the world community is unanimously against this whole thing. And so I think you'll see a world community galvanized and being willing to absorb a lot of this and making sure that these people have dignity and respect. I mean, this is a terrible thing that's happening.
The war in Ukraine is drawing coverage from journalists around the world, putting themselves in danger to bring you the stories. VOA Seruan Kaijo takes you inside war reporting in today's Press Freedom Spotlight.
Amid the crackle of gunfire and thud of a shell hitting, journalists run from a column of flames. This footage, shot in the Ukrainian city of Irpin in early March, is becoming a common scene in a war that has so far claimed the lives of 4 journalists and left others wounded. Media groups and international bodies are stressing safety and reminding all sides that journalists are civilians, not military targets. Warnings increased after Fox News journalists Pierre Zakrzewski and Alexandra Kushinova were killed and correspondent Benjamin Hall was seriously injured near the capital Kyiv on March 14. A day earlier, award-winning American filmmaker Brent Renaud was killed and his colleague Juan Arredondo was injured in Ukraine when their vehicle came under fire. And on March 1, a Russian strike on a TV tower in Kyiv killed Yevgeny Sakun, a Ukrainian camera operator for Live TV.
Journalists under international humanitarian law are civilians, and attacks on civilians are never acceptable, and targeted attacks on journalists in a conflict zone amount to a war crime.
Journalists on the ground are in need of equipment and other help, which is why Reporters Without Borders on March 12 opened a resource center in Lviv near the Polish border. UNESCO is supporting those efforts, providing safety equipment and training resources. Keeping journalists safe is also the focus of the ACUS Alliance. The coalition of news organizations is sharing resources and knowledge to help local media.
We are not an emergencies response organization, as many of our ACUS signatories and members are. But of course, the scale of what's happening is so great that we're doing our best to support, not only our members, but also the journalists on the ground. And we've been supporting in many different ways.
Griffin says journalist deaths in Iraq and Syria should serve as a reminder for newsrooms to conduct proper risk assessments before sending reporters to Ukraine. Beyond dangers in Ukraine, Griffin says the International Press Institute is also documenting repression and censorship in Russia.
We have two actually different and important situations going on. One is obviously the war on the ground in Ukraine and what that means for Ukrainian and foreign journalists covering the conflict. And on the other side, we have this immense wave of repression in Russia itself, targeting independent media.
For those on the ground, the support could go a long way. Sirwan Kejo, WEWE News, Washington.
Before we go, we want to share the story of two musicians who are leaning on their love of music to manage the cruelty of war. Jacopo Lucy has the story of a decade-long friendship that remains strong despite the conflict between their homelands.
I just decided one day when I was 9 years old that I'm going to become a cellist, and this was the coolest thing I could do with my life.
31-year-old Valeria Shilokova is from Ukraine. She moved to the U.S. 20 years ago, but she still has her homeland in her heart.
There's nothing like watching your home burn down. I felt horrible for the next few days, just shattered. And everything hurt. I mean, it was grief.
Shilokova still has her father, relatives, and friends in Ukraine. She says the images from Ukraine make her cry every day. But in the middle of her torment, a message from a friend.
He reached out to me first. It was a very genuine, touching message. Just saying that, that he's heartbroken and that he's with and he feels my grief.
Nikita Morozov is a 35-year-old Russian violinist. He grew up in Montreal, Canada, and often performs with Shilokova. They have been friends since they met more than a decade ago at the Juilliard School in New York City.
I love playing with Nikita, and playing with Nikita reminds me the best of what music is about, and it's mostly a feeling of connection and feeling like you're on the same wave with somebody.
I think it's really important to use discernment and to find, what is the source of the problem, which is Putin. And it is not the Russians, because there are so many Russians who are against this war.
The bond with Morozov helps Shilokova deal with this moment. And to her, it's completely irrelevant that he is from Russia.
Well, I think it's humanity above all else. I mean, I've never seen Nikita as a Russian violinist, and I've never seen myself necessarily as a Ukrainian cellist, and I think it's mutual.
For Shilokova, music is what helps her to get through the day.
Let's take a minute of silence. Thank you.
This is the only thing that takes my mind off of my grief right now. There are two things: is being with people and playing music.
That's why Morozov feels like he must take care of Shilokova more than ever, something he says everybody should do now with all the Ukrainians around the world.
I think, when we go through something difficult and we're there for each other, bonds are made and connections are made, and they're much stronger because you go through something extremely difficult together and you're there for each other, and definitely the friendship becomes stronger.
A music-based friendship that transcends war between countries. For Jacopo Lucy in Washington, Arash Arabasadi, WEWE News.
Follow me on Twitter at @PWeDakuswara and follow WEWE News on Instagram and Facebook. Stay up to date at our website, voanews.com. Thank you for being with us. See you next week on The Inside Story.